extent. Unfortunately, after the Cold War, our foreign policy veered badly off course. We failed to develop a new vision for a new time. In fact, as time went on, our foreign policy began to make less and less sense. Logic was replaced with foolishness and arrogance, which led to one foreign policy disaster after another. They just kept coming and coming. We went from mistakes in Iraq to Egypt to Libya to President Obama's line in the sand in Syria. Each of these actions have helped to throw the region into chaos and gave ISIS the space it needs to grow and prosper. Very bad. It all began with the dangerous idea that we could make Western democracies out of countries that had no experience or interest in becoming a Western democracy. We tore up what institutions they had, and then were surprised at what we unleashed. Civil war, religious fanaticism, thousands of Americans and just killed, lives wasted, horribly wasted. Many trillions of dollars were lost as a result. The vacuum was created that ISIS would fill. Iran, too, would rush in and fill that void, much to their really unjust enrichment. They have benefited so much, so sadly for us. Our foreign policy is a complete and total disaster.
You know, a big reason that I decided to support Donald Trump in 2016 had to do with his foreign policy. As a matter of fact, it was the major motivating factor that got me involved with his campaign at that time. Trump said a lot of other things that I agreed with, but it was the major foreign policy departure from what we had seen under Bush and under Obama that I was most interested in. We were on the brink of war with Russia, on the brink of war with China, on the brink of war with North Korea. We just on the brink of war everywhere, it seemed like, around the globe. And this time it seemed certain that the American homeland would be hit, that there would be nuclear weapons involved, and the devastation to come was going to be considerable, like nothing we'd ever seen before in our history. We could literally end up killing millions of people. That's why I didn't support Ted Cruz. I read his op-eds, his foreign policy statements on his website about Syria and Russia. He was very much like John McCain. I believe if John McCain had become president, as bad as Obama was, I think John McCain would have gotten us involved in World War III, probably within a year of taking office. So when Trump came along and he was willing to stand in front of the party of George W. Bush, Mr. Interventionism, and tell them that it was wrong, that it had done nothing but create a string of disasters all around the world, well, I was all for that. Jumped right on board with that, especially when he articulated his policy in a way that convinced me that it wasn't just empty rhetoric, that he actually understood the reasons why Bush's policies and Obama's policies were flawed, fatally flawed. So I was pleased to get on board with that and support him on that, and he seemed to remain consistent up until yesterday. Now the Syrian situation continues to be a thorn in our side. In 2013, we had a gas attack, chemical weapons attack that led to injuries and deaths there. Obama had declared this to be his red line. As a matter of fact, it was interesting to me. I don't think that everything we've seen going on in the Middle East over the last few years is coincidence. I believe that there have been forces deliberately going into these countries, stirring up these situations, and then using that as a pretext for U.S. intervention. If you haven't seen it, look up General Wesley Clark's video on how he found out right after 9/11 that we had plans to invade 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq, and how that startled him at the time. It's interesting that that policy has not changed, even though administrations have. As a matter of fact, in recent months, I've been interested to find out that we've continued, in spite of Trump's election, in spite of his foreign policy statements, we have continued moving military assets into the region in a way that seems to anticipate a greater conflict there. And I wonder who is doing this, and Trump, if he even has total control of everything going on in the U.S. military now. So we had the gas attack in 2013, and Obama had said just a month or two before that if there was a chemical weapons attack, that would be a red line for us. We would have to get involved. And I remember thinking even at the time, okay, that starts the clock ticking until we see a chemical weapons attack. And sure enough, it did happen. And sure enough, Washington started pounding those war drums. And the Russians got involved in it and said, wait a minute, let's think about this. Other countries, fortunately at the time, got involved as well. And the pressure mounted on Obama from a war-weary U.S. population as well to not get involved until we knew exactly what had happened. Ultimately, we found out it wasn't Assad that launched that chemical weapons attack. It was the rebels. And they did it in an apparent effort to get us involved in that conflict because they weren't succeeding. They had been winning for a while. The so-called moderate opposition teamed, oddly enough, with ISIS, not moderate at all, but we didn't have any qualms about supporting them. And they were making considerable gains in Syria. As a matter of fact, it turns out from remarks that John Kerry made not too long ago that Washington was actually sitting back watching while ISIS gained more and more power in the country because they were thinking this would leverage Assad out of power. Now, this is without any plan to replace Assad. Who is going to replace him? How are you going to have an election in a war-torn country like this when the only forces ready to step into the gap are radical Muslims who are going around killing Christians? That's what our so-called moderate allies there have been doing. Killing Christians, persecuting them, seizing material, burning churches. Saw one of them on video one time, cut the heart out of a dead Syrian army officer, take a bite out of it on camera. I mean, that sounds real moderate, doesn't it? And then we have ISIS. And Washington is deliberately sitting back, according to what Kerry revealed to us, watching as this situation develops. We are so concerned, apparently, about a humanitarian crisis in Syria that we were willing to turn the country over to thugs worse than Assad. And that, I think, speaks volumes about what the motive was. But anyway, after what happened in 2013, one would think we would be careful before we just jump into this. Donald Trump has set a tone in his administration of decisive action. And I think his opposition is now using this against him. And there are opportunists out there who are using this, saying, well, Trump is promising quick action on things like this. If we can just create some outrage, he'll be forced to respond. And he did. Started launching tomahawks against Syria last night. And apparently this is some sort of a punitive action, not designed to be a full-blown intervention. Well, we'll see where that goes, because I have a feeling this is not going to go away. Already the Syrian opposition in the country, those who have been fighting the Assad government and want to oust him there and take over power, are saying that they welcome this, but it's not what they had hoped for. So that leads me to believe that we are going to see worse things yet to come that will be blamed on Assad, used to foster the case for even more interventionism. And of course, we're courting war with Russia here at the same time. Russian Prime Minister Medvedev came out today and said that these strikes take the U.S. one step from military conflict with Russia. And the people that are pointing out the pictures in the media of families with dead children and suffering going on there and saying, how can we allow this? How can we do nothing? I point out to you that if you get us into a conflict with the Russians because somebody's manipulating us, and we go off half-cocked and get into a war with Russia, and that war turns nuclear, as I believe it ultimately must, you're going to have a lot more pictures of families with dead children, okay? And they're going to be your children here in America, except for the elite, of course. The elite and the government and the military, because they've got bunkers to hide in, while the rest of us sign for whatever radioactive airmail packages the Russians decide to send us. So we get to pay the price for the insanity. And we're going to have a lot more we're going to have Americans this time sitting there holding their dead and dying children in the rubble of what used to be their country. Apparently, we're willing to risk tens of millions to allegedly avenge the deaths of dozens or 100 or so, however many it was, that supposedly died in this attack over there, without any actual hard proof that I've seen. No hard proof really that Assad did this. And with a precedent already having been set that you have opposition forces doing what they can to shock the West into intervening on their behalf. You've already got that precedent set, and here we have another attack, and less than 72 hours later, we launch a retaliatory strike against the Syrian government, accepting the narrative without apparently doing a thorough investigation. Now, I've heard some people say, well, the children that were injured in this said they saw Syrian planes overhead, Syrian government aircraft. Look, folks, the Syrian opposition, the moderates, so-called moderates, are pretty despicable people from what I've seen. They are the same radical Islamic element that is out there training children to be suicide bombers. Would it really be too much for them to force these kids to lie to back up their narrative? Oh, we saw the government planes. Would it really be so much for these organizations in Syria to time a chemical weapons attack perpetrated by themselves in conjunction with a government airstrike? They know the government planes are coming to bomb a particular area, so they set this off. Looks very incriminating. And then you've got a president who is basing his administration on more decisive action than his predecessors. You've got a very good recipe right there for some serious stupidity. And I think that's what we're seeing. I believe Trump has bought into this. Now, I could be wrong. Maybe Assad really did do this, but he has no reason to do this. He's winning the war over there. Thanks to the Russians and other allies, whom I don't care for Iran, don't care for Hezbollah. They're pretty despicable people. But they have worked with Assad and they have worked with the Russians to defeat these so-called moderates and to defeat ISIS, which I don't think anybody calls moderate. Maybe, I don't know, maybe Satan would look at them as moderates. But you've got a government that's winning the war. Assad is winning this war. And then suddenly he turns around and uses a gas attack against his people when it's completely unnecessary for him to continue to successfully wage war against his enemies in this country. And when it's almost certain to bring about punitive action from the U.S., as it just did, possibly full-blown intervention, if Trump happens to be in a bad mood on that day, this is totally against his interests. No reason whatsoever why he would do this. We needed to take a time out. We needed to sit back and think about this and do a more thorough investigation before we launch these attacks. I'm very disappointed that Trump would point out the flaws in our foreign policy so well as he has in the past, and then just jump right into the cauldron with an action like this that brings us to the brink of war with Russia. And all I can do is emphasize, folks, if it blows over into war with Russia, we've got a real problem. You want to see a lot of dead, suffering kids? You're going to see it. You're going to see it right here in America. You're going to see it on the order of millions. And for what? Because we were manipulated? And how much are we being manipulated in the situation with North Korea and China? Russia's not a threat to us. They're reacting to people like McCain and people, his colleagues in NATO and others there that are trying to stir up the war drums for their own purposes. Russia's been reacting to people like that for years. The communist Chinese are the real threat. They're the ones who have a real mission of aggression against us. And the North Koreans are just insane. And they're more likely than ever now to launch a preemptive strike on Japan and South Korea. And I think that could happen almost any time, especially if Donald Trump is being tricked into acting this way. And it's just funny. You know, it's so funny. Everybody who has lied about Trump, everybody who has hated him, everybody who has said all these despicable things about him is now patting him on the back. I mean, folks, when the people who have shown themselves to be your enemies, your consistent enemies throughout this whole thing, and have shown themselves willing to twist and lie and manipulate to do everything they can to destroy you, are all for a particular policy, you really need to sit back and ask yourself some hard questions before you do things they want you to do. I mean, you got John McCain and Lindsey Graham now patting Trump on the back. When you've got McCain and Graham happy with you, you're doing something wrong. By definition, you've done something wrong. You have stepped over into the twilight zone. So it's my hope that Trump will sit back, that he will begin to think things through, the evidence will come out. If this was indeed an action by the rebels designed to draw the U.S. into it, Trump's going to have egg on his face if that happens. But, I mean, he can point his finger around at everybody else, too, who encouraged him to do what they did, as long as we don't do it again. So I'm hoping that Trump's base will put pressure on him to not repeat the mistakes of his predecessors, the very mistakes he railed against in his campaign, the mistakes that have been threatening us with nuclear destruction for years now, and still do. Again, Medvedev saying we're one step away from military clash with Russia. Not a good time for us, folks. Serious things need to be considered. And given the attitude in Washington, the devil may care attitude, I would encourage those of you who haven't to start doing some serious preparations for the possibility of world war, the possibility of nuclear conflict. Getting yourself some supplies, learning about radioactive fallout, how to deal with it, could save your lives, lives of your family members. If war does start with Russia, folks, I would get out of the major cities. I would not wait. When you hear that, if you hear especially that tactical nuclear weapons have been used in any theater, I would get out of the major cities. If it's in a conflict involving Russia and China, and North Korea might be a little different, but North Korea, I think, is going to pull China into it. But if we're in a conflict with Russia and or China, and anywhere in that theater, tactical nuclear weapons are used, my advice to you is to get out of the cities immediately, because strategic nuclear weapons might not be very far behind. It could be a matter of minutes. And I would be ready to get out of there. War starts, I would have some bags packed. I'd have supplies packed. I'd have a place to go picked out. And I would get all your cash out of the bank, have it ready to go. And as soon as you hear that any kind of tactical nuke has been used anywhere, get out of Dodge. We live, as the Chinese would say, in interesting times. And that was a curse, a Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. Well, the media and the neocons have made sure that we do live in interesting times. And it's hard to tell just how more interesting they're going to get before the whole thing is over. I don't see this ending well. If you don't know the Lord Jesus Christ, I suggest you seek him now while you have time. Provision for your physical needs is one thing, but provision for the spiritual needs is even more important, quite a bit more so. And I hope this country turns itself around, begins to see that in the future. In the meantime, pray for Trump, pray for wisdom, pray for the fear of God to fall on both sides. All the various sides, I should say. There's far more than one, and that's what makes the situation so dangerous. Another thing about it that makes it so dangerous, there's so many people involved, so many nations, so many conflicting interests, so much potential for something to go wrong, and that's all it would take. A misunderstanding leading to a string of reactions that just steadily or instantly escalates to something truly tragic. I hope we can avoid that. I pray we can avoid that. Take care of yourselves. Put pressure on Trump to back off on this thing and to act decisively on good information. I agree with Rand Paul. We don't have an interest over there. We really should not be involved in it in the first place. And our involvement has just made it worse. But we are involved. We can't just stop that now on a dime. I wish we could. And I'd like to see us pull out tomorrow and not have anything further to do with it, but that's not realistic given Washington's aims and the people that are running things behind the scenes. So God bless. Wish everyone well, and make your preparations. I heard you. Make preparations to deal with things because it could get out of hand in a big hurry.